Hello and welcome to video lecture number 93. Today we are talking about the Great Society, Liberalism at High Tide. Our subsections today are John F. Kennedy's Promise, Lyndon B. Johnson and the Liberal Resurgence, and the Women's Movement Reborn. So the transfer of power from President Eisenhower to President Kennedy struck many as a generational turning point. Kennedy was 27 years younger than his predecessor. Kennedy put the matter this way in his inaugural address: "The torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans." Television sales grew explosively during the 1950s, and this was Kennedy's medium of choice. The first two documents in this chapter deal with important episodes in the public career of John F. Kennedy, both of which drew large television audiences. Senator Kennedy's 4 debates with Vice President Richard Nixon, his opponent for the presidency in 1960, were, of course, staged for television. Kennedy's inaugural address the following January conveyed his hopes for the nation and his administration. Before being elected as vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson was a seasoned politician who had served nearly a quarter of a century in the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. With the assassination of John Kennedy in November of 1963, Johnson was thrust into the presidency. By the time he won a landslide victory in the presidential election of 1964, Johnson had already begun to enact an ambitious liberal agenda, pushing through civil rights, social welfare, and environmental legislation. Now, feminism also revived in the 1960s, led by politically active older women and by younger women, many of whom had been radicalized by the experience of being subordinated by men in the civil rights, student, and anti-war protest movements of the era. So let's dive in and have a closer look at the Great Society with our first subsection, which is John F. Kennedy's Promise. President Kennedy practiced what became known as the New Politics, an approach that emphasized youthful charisma, style, and personality more than issues and platforms. His youthful enthusiasm inspired a younger generation and laid the groundwork for an era of liberal reform. Now, on November 22nd, 1963 in Dallas, Texas, President Kennedy was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. Lyndon Johnson was then sworn in as president. Kennedy's youthful image, the trauma of his assassination, and the sense that Americans had been robbed of a promising leader contributed to a powerful mystique that continues today surrounding John F. Kennedy. All right, let's look at Lyndon B. Johnson then and the liberal resurgence. Lyndon Johnson was the opposite of Kennedy, a seasoned Texas politician and longtime Senate leader. Johnson was most at home in the back rooms of power. He was a rough-edged character who had scrambled his way up without too many scruples to wealth and political eminence. But he never forgot his modest hill country origins or lost his sympathy for the downtrodden. Johnson lacked the Kennedy style, but he capitalized on Kennedy's assassination, applying his astonishing energy and negotiating skills to bring to fruition several of Kennedy's stalled programs and many more of his own in the ambitious Great Society. On assuming the presidency, Johnson promptly pushed for civil rights legislation as a memorial to his slain predecessor. His motives were complex. As a Southerner who had previously opposed civil rights for African Americans, Johnson wished to prove that he was more than a regional figure. He would be the president of all the people. Now, wherever he acted, Johnson pursued an ambitious goal of putting an end to poverty in our time. The war on poverty expanded long-established social insurance programs, welfare programs, and public works programs. The Office of Economic Opportunity, which was established by the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, created programs that you might be familiar with, such as Head Start, the Job Corps, Upward Bound, and Volunteers in Service to America, and the Community Action Program. When Johnson defeated Republican Senator Barry Goldwater for the presidency in 1964, he won in a landslide. And this provided a mandate for his administration, meaning that the people wanted what he was promoting. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 authorized $1 billion in federal funds to benefit impoverished children. The Higher Education Act provided the first federal scholarships for college students. Another aspect of public welfare addressed by the Great Society was the environment. Johnson pressed for expansion of the national park system, improvement of the nation's air and water, and increased land use planning. Liberal Democrats brought about significant changes also in immigration policy with the passage of the Immigration Act of 1965, which abandoned the quota system of the 1920s. By the end of 1965, the Johnson administration had compiled the most impressive legislative record of liberal reforms since the New Deal. It had put issues of poverty, justice, and access at the center of national political life, and it expanded the federal government's role in protecting citizens' welfare. The results of the war on poverty were that the poor were better off in an absolute sense, but they remained far behind the middle class in a relative sense. The proportion of Americans living below the poverty line dropped from 20% to 13% between 1963 and 68. Let's move on and talk about the women's movement Reborn, our last section. Feminist concerns were kept alive in the 1950s and 60s by working women who campaigned for such things as maternity leave and equal pay for equal work. As the women's movement grew from influences such as Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, it generated an array of women-oriented services and organizations led by the white middle class, such as the National Organization for Women, NOW. After the post-war baby boom, women were again having fewer children, aided by the birth control pill, which was first marketed in 1960. And as states liberalized divorce laws, more and more women were divorcing. Ironically, the calls by white middle-class women for reform helped to further fracture the fragile New Deal coalition. All right, so that's it. This concludes our video lecture for today. Go ahead and answer your review questions now and continue on with your work.